Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Last Mile Discovery Cafe session. My name is Nimra. I'm part of the Partners Innovation team, and my job is to make sure everything runs on time. We have about 70 minutes for the session today, including Q&A. And it's also my pleasure to introduce our moderator, Dr. Keith Dreyer, who is the Chief Data Science Officer for the Partners Healthcare System. He's an Associate Professor of Radiology at the Harvard Medical School and the Vice Chairman of Radiology at Mass General. I'll let Keith take it away.
Thank you very much. I think I got it. I'm all mic'd up. Thank you very much, Nimra. Appreciate it. And welcome, everybody. We're going to see more people coming in over the next 10 minutes or so. This is, I believe, oversubscribed, but the big session just broke seconds ago. So we waited a few minutes, so thanks for tolerating. There's also food outside, so if you want to grab lunch either before, during, after, absolutely fine. There's questions that you can submit, as with the other sessions, through the Q&A process. So feel free to do that. I think this is a small enough group we could interact. If you just don't want to do that and raise your hand, feel free to do that as well. So before we get started, I'm just going to ask the group to, the esteemed panel to introduce themselves, please.
Sure. First, I'd like to apologize. I didn't get the memo to wear a dark suit, so.
We'll wait. Won't change.
My name is Andriole, and I am the Director of Research at the Massachusetts General Hospital and Brigham and Women's Hospital Center for Clinical Data Science, where we are implementing, designing, developing, and integrating particularly machine learning models to impact healthcare. And we have a huge focus on putting things back at the point of care in the clinical environment.
I'm Sandy Aronson. I direct IT for Partners Personalized Medicine. Really appreciate the chance to be part of this panel. Our group builds IT support for clinical departments that identify ways that algorithms can be used to rebuild their care delivery processes for the goal. And increasingly, we're starting to see the realization of fundamentally improved care for patients.
Hi, I'm Pete Durlach. I run strategy and new business development for the Nuance healthcare division here in Boston. Probably the company's best known for providing AI-powered solutions for clinical documentation decision-making, such as Dragon Medical and PowerScribe. We have about 600,000 clinicians, and about 80% of all radiologists use our systems every day in concert with our partners like Seth over here from Epic. And so we are in the business of basically delivering real-time intelligence at the point of care, and have been in the AI business for a long time, and now we're expanding that into other parts of the AI ecosystem.
Good morning. I'm Seth Hain. I'm in research and development at Epic, and I work with our analytics and machine learning products. On the machine learning side, that includes a platform for embedding machine learning models in real time into workflows, as well as a library of machine learning models that organizations can use out of the box as part of their workflows, which I'm sure we'll get into later today.
Hi, I'm Jonathan Teich. I'm CMIO of InterSystems right across the bridge in Cambridge. We are essentially the grand aggregators of data, bringing together all kinds of multi-source, multi-provider, multi-patient data for all kinds of different uses, and developing clinical solutions out of that, where we support a whole lot of AI things on top of our platform. I'm an active emergency medicine physician at the Brigham, and spent a long time leading the IT R&D charge there, where I really focused a lot on clinical decision support, which I think probably is the last mile of AI in many ways.
So thank you very much, all. And with that, it's great because there's a diversity of consumers, creators, and also different types of applications. So let me ask the group, just to get started, what are some of the applications that you've deployed or are responsible for, that you see coming down the pipeline? Pick one of your favorite one, and then I just want to dive into it a little bit deeper. So Seth, why don't you go ahead?
We tend to see folks using kind of 4 different areas of machine learning. A few years ago, the focus was really around acute settings, things like predicting early onset of sepsis, fall risk, those sorts of things in an acute space, or say risk stratification in a population health space. More and more, I'm seeing algorithms deployed in the context of either improving or both improving operations, say predicting flow through the hospital to improve and better understand nursing staffing requirements, or more and more, the context of what we call relevance, having the workflow adapt to the situation and context of both the provider and the patient in the room, and using machine learning to help surface into the workflow the relevant parts of the chart.
Pete.
Yeah, so I think a couple things. It's, again, from the Nuance perspective, we always find it a little bit funny to talk about all the buzz of AI, because speech recognition really was the original mainstream application of AI in healthcare. So again, we have solutions on PowerScribe and Dragon that allow clinicians to document care in real time today, and they all use advanced AI neural nets to do that. So those are widespread deployment of those solutions. In terms of the emerging areas, there's really two. One very connected to what Seth just mentioned, which is as the clinician is documenting, as most folks know, clinicians really aren't in the business of documenting and dealing with the administrative burden. They're there to take care of patients. But the operations, financial metrics, quality scores of the care providers are driven by what's documented. So there's a huge gap between how sick the patient is, what's required to get paid, and what drives your quality scores from what you document, not just what you actually do with the patient. So we provide AI-powered solutions where, as the clinical teams are taking care of the patient, we actually look through the entire chart and provide real-time feedback using advanced AI. That's really starting to take off. And the second piece, on the imaging side, we're driving AI into the radiology workflow in two places. One is the radiologist is dictating, we're extracting real-time data from the report and driving evidence-based follow-up. Keith's very familiar with this, to drive evidence-based follow-up recommendations, where we can then structure the report, take out the findings and the follow-up as structured data, send it to folks like Epic, and then they can drive all the downstream follow-up automatically. And now we're working with a number of partners here on the image classification side to build what we call an AI marketplace, which is connect all the publishers of AI algorithms with our large footprint. Again, 80% of radiologists use our system. So as a publisher, you can single-click publish an algorithm into the cloud, and then any subscriber can automatically subscribe to that and inject it into their workflow without separate BAA agreements, without worrying about the DICOM connections, any of the last mile connections to the imaging infrastructure or the radiology information system in that case.
So Jonathan, how's that relate to some of the things that you're doing? And also historically, I know you did a lot with decision support. So how can we learn from decision support as we go to AI?
Sure. And there's a couple of things. I'll list two applications that we're working on specifically that one of which is somewhat mundane sounding, and some of which a little bit more glorious sounding. We do this to match up patients, right? When you're dealing with a large range of medical centers that are trying to combine data across the country, across a region, you have the whole patient matching problem, which is not so bad if you're trying to match Jonathan Teich, much trickier if you're trying to match Maria Garcia or something along that line. So being able to do AI to really sort of start to optimize and re-optimize the matching algorithm turns out to be a very important, if mundane, issue. The other area is sort of more interesting. We're combining NLP and AI to do things like get context out of notes. So the VA is very interested in discovering early signs of suicidality in their patient population. So can we take a look at notes, at progress notes going back months and years, and be able to understand context there that actually is predictive of things? So I think a lot of those things are important. And to the other side of your question, what's important about this from the clinician side is, how do I receive this? How do I consume this? So they don't necessarily want to have a long look at large algorithmic trees. They want to have something that says, here's a red blinking light on your EHR, and it says, you should look at your patient's suicidality index because something is up. So taking all the stuff we do, being the duck paddling like crazy underwater, that's our AI algorithms, and then being able to give you a little something smooth-looking duck on top that says, you should look at this because something's important going on.
So Kathy and Sandy, we'll get to you in a second, but just to kind of, let me ask a different theme or slice this from a different angle, is that I know one of the challenges we have with applications we deploy is the classic too many clicks. And so how do you handle giving people more information but not overloading them with information? How do you kind of turn this off as needed, or what does the dashboard look like now, and what is it going to look like going forward?
This is a classic problem, and everyone has heard about alert fatigue over time, and it's certainly continues 15, 20 years after the term was invented to be one of the biggest annoyances and some of the biggest hindrances to computers actually doing all that they could. You're absolutely right. If we give somebody all the data, all the information, they won't have enough time to filter out the stuff that's really important. And we look at things that can be very simple. In general, if I'm a clinician looking at a chart, especially an emergency clinician, I have 3 minutes to learn about somebody, I'm going to want to have something more or less hitting me over the head that says, here's what's important. So a lot of this is about filtering. A lot of this is about saying, I've discovered 25 things about your patient, but there's 2 that are more important than the others. And in 60-point font on your screen in front of you, I'm going to give you a big red something that says do this. So I think that being able to be filtered, being able to be parsimonious and not show everything, and being able to have something that can be a very short, glowing item that says, look deeper into this, will give me the best chance of accepting this.
I would also add that when the artificial intelligence or machine learning is designed with a very clear intention of action in the workflow, there's often opportunities to kind of circumvent a fair amount of this kind of in-process alerting and sorting through, say, the inputs into the model. It brings to mind a story. Auctioner down in Louisiana used our platform to deploy a deep learning model they had created. And initially, they built out the model to predict adverse events 4 hours in advance of them occurring on the med-surg floors. And the workflow they developed around it was the intention of sending a message to someone in the ICU, a physician, to come down to the patient's bedside and intervene and explore what was going on. They didn't need to understand why. They'd staffed it in a way that workflow was all that was going to be driven by the AI in this context. Over time then, they saw one of the opportunities to improve that was they were spending time with patients that would have been more appropriate for palliative care to have come and visited instead. And so they built another AI algorithm to identify the individuals on the floor that palliative care should spend time with. And in that context, it was simply a matter of reprioritizing the list of patients that the palliative care physicians were spending time with. So in these different situations, you're using artificial intelligence, but you don't need to worry about this kind of alert fatigue overload if you have a strong tie back into the workflow.
Got it. So, Sandy, I'm hearing a lot of different, at least applications, if not maybe different approaches to the integration or solution. Are there commonalities here? Are there ways to look at this through a single lens?
Yeah, it's interesting. So just to share some of our experiences internally. So every project, every care transformation project that our team gets involved with is fundamentally based on an algorithm. But the vast majority of the time, they aren't machine learning based algorithms yet. They aren't AI based algorithms yet. The exception to that is situations where we are scanning a patient population for patients at risk for disease or who might benefit from a specific program or action, where there is a human that will evaluate what those steps before they are actually taken. So this is similar to what Seth was describing in terms of prioritizing patient populations. To give an example of this, that I do think draws back to how we can start to think about, like one way to think about this problem of cognitive overload and how you deal with that. So if we take cardiology, 2 programs that we're working on. One, scan patient populations for those at risk for inherited heart disease, a disease where the first symptom is often sudden death. So we want to identify them early, working to launch that. Another program that is launched, scanning populations for patients with heart failure who would benefit from more proactive treatment, where you use artificial intelligence to identify those patients. But once you've identified them, you get them into custom programs that are based on navigators backed by algorithms and pharmacists and cardiologists who can actually take them through the drug selection and titration process far faster than we can do in existing medical care. And you just see the blood pressure, the lipids just drop when you do that. So I think that there's these general interventions that we try to apply in different areas, but ultimately you want to get really specific, and by getting really specific, you can both you can deal with the complexity in a different way, and you can focus on a particular clinical outcome.
Great. Okay, we'll come back to this topic, but there was a question that came in from the audience, and it is Secretary Carter earlier today discussed the need to be able to explain AI. Does the panel agree with that, and also what are the challenges that does that present, and how to overcome those? So, Kathy, start with you. Lucky you.
I wanted to add to the other discussion, but
feel free.
So I think add to the other discussion, and I'll address this. And what we do at the center, we have always involved is a clinical champion on every project that we do. So a very detailed understanding of the workflow and how we can put inference from a model back into the clinical arena is really dependent on that particular environment. So everything that we do, whether it's we were born out of radiology, so we're doing a lot of detection of things that may be difficult or missable by a human being, or doing things that are tedious and improving the efficiency of what a radiologist, as an example, might do, and providing clinical decision support at the point of care, but understanding that we can't implement this to add to their workflow. It has to be embedded into their workflow. The idea of having explainable AI, and Europe is being a little stricter about this than we are in the States, it's not completely a total black box, particularly when you're talking about using imaging as the data, because there are understandable things that are happening at the very beginning layers of what's going on in a machine learning model. For example, it's doing very much what our ganglion cells in the back of our visual system are doing. They're looking for features out in our visual scene. They're looking for edges, they're looking for texture, size, and location of things. And we're actually computing those now mathematically. So it is understandable, and I think one of the things that is very helpful to our clinicians is to use an attention map or a saliency map that shows where the model is looking, quote unquote. Where is it emphasizing and seeing that there's important information there that is giving us the result of the model. So for example, the sort of hello world for machine learning in radiology is doing a bone age. And if people don't know, what is done is an x-ray is taken of the hand of a child who is either growing too fast or too slowly, and they want to understand how does the chronological age match the physiologic age. And what we can do is do a machine learning algorithm to estimate that age in that patient, the biologic age. And it turns out where the model is typically looking is at the carpal bones. And that's exactly what a radiologist would do, is look in that area to see the development of those. So we can, I think, understand where the model is looking. That may be reassuring to people who are receiving that. But I do think that physicians ought not to blindly accept the result of a model. It's not magic, and they need to use their common sense that there are errors where the model may fail, and they need to understand that and act accordingly.
Great. Thoughts on explicability?
Sure. I mean, I think it's ridiculously important, and I will give one short exception at the end of this, but I think it's wild if you're a physician, you're a nurse, and you're taking care of somebody, and the algorithm is saying do X, and it's not the algorithm that's actually writing the order to do X, and it's not the algorithm that's legally responsible for do X. So being able to have some understanding of where this came from is very important. We see this in order sets, a more nowadays mundane kind of decision support, which says, you've seen a patient with pneumonia, we recommend you do A, B, and C and use this antibiotic. And a lot of people will say, well, I'm not going to use this antibiotic unless you can explain. And so even in there, it's been important to expand that out and to say, well, we use this one for this reason and we use this one for that reason. And in the US, of course, the FDA has more or less dictated that clinical decision support does need to explain itself in various ways. The one that struck me as an exception is that if I have something that's simple and evidence correlated, I can do something. And the example I'm thinking of is a test called D-dimer, which is a clotting test which relates to the diagnosis of pulmonary embolism, blood clot in your lung, which is hard to diagnose. And there's this magic number, which appeared about 15 years ago. And they said, well, if it's more than 500, then you should worry. And if it's less than 500, don't even think about it. And that's not easily explained. People don't realize that this is actually some part of the coagulation cascade of proteins. But in fact, all I know is that's a good number. So that's the other example that because it's actionable and it's evidence proven. But in most complex things, I got to know why.
That's great.
I think that there's two concepts that tend to get conflated here. There's the question of explainability of the algorithm into the workflow. For example, you can hover over in our workflows and see, assuming the algorithm provided the information, the importance of the different inputs into the model. Now, you don't need to surface that all the time, but if folks want to gain a deeper appreciation of what was behind it, they can get into that level of detail. On the other hand, depending on the workflow, what's really necessary might be transparency around the development process and what went into creating the model and how that aligned with the workflow. And I think that in some cases, transparency is sufficient depending on the context of the workflow. So both concepts, explainability kind of in the workflow, transparency around the development process, I think can be used to answer the question.
Yeah, Keith, the other thing, just connected on this, I think Seth brought it up before, it also depends on the use case.
Yeah.
Right, so your discussion of the work list, right? So in our world, this idea of prioritizing a work list is universal, right? And when you prioritize a work list, if you're wrong, it's not the end.
Describe to the audience what the work list is.
Right, so
in the
basically
context.
think of the work list as just what is the next set of things I should work on within the flow. So that could be a physician, it could be a coder, CDI, it could be a care navigator, it could be anybody, right? So when you use AI to say, I've looked through the relevant data, and it looks like these people need more, the palliative care is a classic example, there's a million of these, they need more emphasis because it's more urgent. That's kind of a universal archetype for deploying AI, and if you're wrong, it's not that big a deal. So you pick the wrong patient out of 50. If you're giving a real-time decision support to a clinician who has to make a real-time decision ordering a thing, you're wrong, like you have big problems, right? So the intersection of what the use case is with what hurdle you need to jump through has a direct effect. There's not one answer to this. So again, focusing on, not that you shouldn't focus on the clinical stuff, because that has obviously tremendous value, but the bar you have to jump over, whether it's transparency, how they built the model, what you show, you can get there, but the bar is higher than if you're saying, I'm going to try to make someone more productive, and the cost of being wrong is not quite as high. So these things intersect in a lot of ways.
Yeah, to extend on all of the previous comments, I do think that what this comes down to is, what we're doing is we're creating new clinical processes that algorithms are a part of. And the goal is that those new clinical processes need to be safe. So what we find at the core, and I think this is totally consistent with what's been described, at the core of the development process, you need to have a hazard analysis methodology where you are constantly identifying potential hazards, classifying them relative to both their likelihood and their severity, and then taking actions to mitigate them, where sometimes a false positive or false negative is not a major safety risk, and other times it is. So I think that kind of process from a variety of standpoints, transparency, things related to bias, all of the different things that we're worried about interjecting into the process, I think evaluating those as hazards is the key.
So Jensen said something the other day on the fireside chat. Jensen Wang was talking about dual systems running inside of autonomous vehicles, and he kind of thinks of artificial or machine intelligence and human intelligence as just two forms of intelligence that are now trying to make the decision. So if there is explicability available, I assume, let's hope for a while at least, that the human is the one that decides between the two, which is more intelligent. So how do you allow that kind of rapport to happen between the machine intelligence and the human intelligence without wasting time in the human process? Is that also use case driven, would you say? And
Yeah, I mean, for us, we talk about AI as augmenting human intelligence. I mean, certainly there are cases where you can remove the human, but we don't really believe, especially in healthcare, that that's where we are today. And so the goal from our perspective is it's fundamentally believed on augmenting, right? Can we help them or her do her job better or more efficiently, and then learn in a dynamic way from what people do or they don't do. So for us, we very much believe in this combination of the human side with the technology side. And then you have to intersect the use cases where the mix can be very different, right? And the hazard problem can be very different. But fundamentally, it's about making the people more effective, more efficient, and delivering better care at lower cost.
Got it.
But I think there are some back office things that might be automated already that may not need human intervention. So, we're talking about a lot of the sexy stuff like diagnosis and clinical decision support at the point of care. But what about, optimizing scheduling of an MR scanner? If we have an empty MR scanner, that's a very expensive piece of equipment sitting there. Can we anticipate what types of patients may be likely to be a no-show? And if we can do that, we can be more effective and efficient in our processes, but don't know that we need to have a human intervention there necessarily.
So, a good question from the audience. Reimbursement on this stuff. So, is there payment for this? and knowing the answer is probably no, then how do you justify this? How do you pay for it? What's the cost benefit curve? What are you hearing, or what do you think?
Yeah, so, I mean, people don't buy, generally, people don't buy AI to buy AI. They don't buy AI to buy AI. It's just it's a cool tech. They buy it to solve a problem. So in our world, if you can make clinicians more productive, if you can drive higher reimbursement, if you can lower costs, if you can reduce rework, if you can automatically schedule, that's where the ROI comes from. So people are buying AI today from us and Epic and others in droves. It's all about the use case. Some are more mature than others. Some have more established ROIs than others. I mean, it's still early in a lot of these use cases, but there are ROI cases all over. The problem you get into is if you just kind of show up with a cool demo that works in one place and have no way to drive it into the workflow, you have no metrics of how it actually moves a KPI that someone's willing to pay for, then you get stuck, in my experience.
Yeah, I think increasingly it's about embedding machine learning just into the development process of the application and providing the hooks and opportunities for innovation kind of within those spaces. So as an example, recently, using the platform we provide, Rush Medical Center in Chicago built a model for identifying patients that are likely to leave the ED without being seen. And they have found that by identifying those patients and then having somebody go spend time with them, they can decrease the number leaving by 50%, which Dr. Shafiq Rob, the CIO there, is estimating is going to save them over $1 million a year. So there's real ROI there, but it's really about kind of bringing it into the workflow and just making it a natural part of the software, I think.
Yeah, I think I totally believe there are instances where AI can reduce the cost of current services while improving care, and those are just straight wins for everyone, right? The other commercialization model here is to actually look at places where AI can actually enable you to launch a new clinical service. And then that's about getting a CPT code for that service, like has happened in the cardiology service that I was just mentioning. And so there's commercialization. If you look across the industry, there's commercialization at the technology level, but then there's also, in my view, more excitingly, commercialization at the service level.
Go ahead, John.
No, I think that's very true. I think that AI is going to be a source of greater process efficiency by far. Even in radiology, you can imagine, here I've got 1,000 scans with 50,000 images to look through. And if I can get something which says you really only have to spend most of your cognitive energy on this and this, that's going to make a whole lot more efficiency, and that's going to turn into money itself. So I agree with everybody else. It's in the delivery of it.
Yeah, Keith, just to add one more example to build on Kath's example, to Kathy's point, I mean, we have a large client who put AI in to, again, improve the quality of the documentation. And within 6 months, this is a large 26 hospital IDN. They improved their reimbursement, no change in payer mix or volume, $36 million a year. And they moved their severity for risk of mortality and severity of illness 36 to 24% to the right to the extreme within 6 months. Okay, so to Seth's point, that's already a process they were doing, but AI made a dramatic difference because the humans just did not have the time and wherewithal, given everything else going on, to actually look through all the charts across all payers with the complexity and the burden they have. So there's like 1 million examples like that today versus a new CPT for a service. That's a great opportunity too, but you have to get to that point like telehealth where they'll pay for it, which I'm sure is coming. But there's these very point solutions. And Seth's example, I think you have like 200, you mentioned to me like 270 organizations that are deploying models for various use cases, right, on type of hyperscale?
We have over 275 organizations across the Epic community deploying machine learning models into their production systems these days. So it's entirely viable when they see the workflow and the outcomes that it can drive and have that as kind of a clinical program, to Sandy's point, that they can implement and drive forward. And it's really that clinical program that ends up driving the outcome with the physicians and the caregivers. It's the AI that just helps them get a couple extra percentage points on it often.
So Kathy, I'll direct this toward you. The same kind of thing, touching on Jonathan's point, picture for radiology, for example, if I've got thousands of images in a particular case, but these 4 are the ones I should look at. We're talking about a redesign of the workstation today? Because workstations today have been optimized for getting through those 10,000 images in a case. Is the UI wrong? What's going to happen there?
Well, I think the UI could be improved. We always think that we can improve the PACS UI and the interfaces to the other systems. But I think what we're doing in implementing some of those systems, an example I'll use is stroke detection in the ED, and reordering the work list and putting that patient towards the top, notifying the stroke team that there's a concern that there may be stroke in this patient. There's so much volume that radiologists have to get through today that alerting them to what are the most important to do can be as easy as using color or putting something at the top of the list. But I think some of these applications may even go back further into the imaging chain, maybe at the scanner, for example. If we see a patient not necessarily detecting disease, but seeing that there's motion in that particular scan, identifying that while the patient is still in the scanner and having them be rescanned at that time rather than having them come back and so on. So I think it's very use case driven, but I think we can work within the user interfaces. What we are finding as folks who are implementing these things in the clinical arena is that different vendors have different ways to implement the inference in those user interfaces, and there really aren't any standards. We have models that are creating output. What is the format for that output, and how should it be received at a system at the point of care? And that would be helpful to understand what vendors are thinking around that and how they may be able to receive that information. But again, I think the point comes back to having a clinician involved at every step and having them help define what that workflow is, help define what some of the mimics may be and where the errors may be and so forth. But we have a ways to go.
So another couple questions coming in this area. I'll try and consolidate them. So if you wanted to get involved at an institution to be able to create AI, obviously data is key. I'll kind of segment the data into textual data and then image-based data. So from the text-based data side, people are asking, how do I get all that data? How do I get it to me structured so that I can, at least if I did have a system to start to create models, how do I have it prepared for me? And I'll ask these separately. Imaging will come second, but and then Pete, maybe you're kind of crossing the 2 boundaries because there's text and images. So Jonathan and Seth, maybe you could talk a little bit about the imaging or the text part. Pete, kind of the combination. Kathy, maybe imaging, and then Sandy, you could talk about how this thing gets deployed into that environment in the EHR.
Yeah.
That's going to take a while.
I haven't even figured out the whole sequence at this point. I was kind of thinking that text was going to wind up in Pete's chair pretty quickly. That's okay. But no, I think that going across the board, it's really a matter of having some kind of, this is about standards in some sense. It's about having some kind of common representation. In our case, what we're dealing with is disparity of standards across lots of people, because our world is, this EMR speaks this language, and this mental health system speaks that language, this rehab system speaks that language. Even in the case of text, we're getting some things as PDFs, we're getting some things as HL7 segments, a bunch of different ways to do it. So there's that first level of trying to carve everything into what looks like your canonical text format. I think the second part is really about how to understand what are the important categories you're going after. I mean, even a great NLP algorithm is going to have a hard time if it doesn't have some kind of narrowing of the field to work with. So being able to say, yes, I'm looking at this because I'm looking at clinical gains, I'm looking at, trying to extract social determinants. I may find myself running very different algorithms for very different problem spaces. But I think that with regard to text, it continues to be a challenge. And maybe I'll ask Pete if it's getting to be less of a challenge. But I think it's something where trying to codify that still remains a greater challenge than doing that, say, for structured data.
I'll just add on to that, and then I think it'll probably segue nicely into kind of what you guys are doing on the voice side in particular, that the opportunity, so behind the scenes of the software we developed, a fair amount of discrete data is being captured that then kind of coalesces into the text that folks read. So oftentimes you have the opportunity to leverage the direct discrete data rather than going after the text. That said, the advances that are taking place around deep learning techniques to incorporate textual data in the same way that you would traditionally use an image in that space to then either derive features that you put into another model as inputs, or just as another feature into the prediction for the types of workflows we were talking about earlier. There's great strides in that. And more we're just using that technique rather than taking a sentence and trying to piece it apart in a way that a human would understand. Right. Suddenly that text is just another input into the prediction.
Yeah, this is to state the obvious, so it's good to do that. I think the biggest challenge, I think Seth, Epic for sure is trying to solve this. We're trying to solve it in a slightly different angle, is beyond the normalization issue and whether you're doing parsing on text, is as a third party, how do you get access to this stuff, right? So even if you extract like the low-level technical issues, as you all know, we're in this interesting part of the world where what does being open mean, and that's evolving, and all of these things, because at the end of the day, you've got to get access to the stuff, whatever it is, and so it's a non-trivial problem. But I think for a number of us, I know Epic is doing this, we're doing it, others, we're trying to turn our individual software systems into open platforms, and we're doing that in slightly different ways with different. Coming from different origins, but effectively, I know Epic is doing this, we're doing this so that both us and third parties can leverage those footprints, assuming that the clients whose data it is has authorized you to use it. You can do more interesting things. Epic's opening up their whole infrastructure on App Orchard and the infrastructure. Seth gave a couple examples of 270 clients deploying models. We're doing the same stuff on top of our platform that happens to intersect very much with what Epic is doing. And we're doing that on the imaging. As you know, on the imaging side, we're opening up our whole image sharing platform and reporting platform so any third-party developer can leverage our infrastructure that's already connected to all these DICOM endpoints and all the EHR endpoints to basically build imaging classification algorithms without them having to go to every client, negotiate BAAs, and do it. And there's this whole trust issue. So we're really trying to open the thing up to try to create a better flow of the data so that people can innovate in the real intelligence part and then deliver that. And some of that will be delivered directly into hyperspace in Epic or another EHR. In some cases, it has to happen while they're documenting, and that's a natural place for us. Or on the radiology side, wouldn't it be great to have it to be able to ingest a couple of AI algorithms and just click a button, have it do all the moving of the images that I come, and have the results show up in my viewer and my reporting system when you put off the work list, right? So I think this is a real fast-moving space, but I think within a few years, the viscosity of the data will be much higher than it is. You still have the issue, though, that under HIPAA, how are you going to get access to that? Like we're in a luxurious position, Epic and us, since we have large footprints. We have BAAs with all of our clients, effectively. I won't speak for Epic, but in our case, where we can use the data to improve the service that we're contracted for the client. So us being able to get data to do stuff with is not that hard. For someone coming in from the outside, you've got to get basically sign off for every case of this. So it's a challenge that's not trivial, but I think it's getting easier.
This open platform concept also makes it much more straightforward to bring that intelligence into the workflow with understanding of it, rather than just at a data element to data element level. You have the opportunity to take an algorithm as an example and drop it into our platform, or kind of use something like the Nuance technologies as a new way to get input into the system. And so it functions at an abstraction level that's higher, that more aligns with how the organization is building out practices.
And I think that collection of data issue is something that's being more and more solved. You know, one of the places where you can get some of these is in the health information exchanges. There are still, you know, some of them have thrived, although many have gone under. And we find that these have already done a lot of the HIPAA reconciliation, a lot of that. So, for example, we work with, among other people, work with HealthX, which has 16 million patients in the New York City area. And we actually work with HBI, which is doing predictive modeling on our data. So we provide the data supply, and we collect all the text as well as the structured data, put it into a common format, and then HBI works on top of our platform to actually do these various kinds of algorithms, and they're doing prediction of readmission and so on. So you can there are large pools which have done some of this HIPAA reconciliation so far.
So yeah, Kathy, okay, so someone's sitting there with a massive amount of image stores and they want to be able to do some of this stuff, but it's locked inside of a PACS system. What do they do?
Sure. Well, first, just to speak to the data democratization piece, I think that needs to happen, because what we're currently seeing, at least in imaging, is that algorithms are not very generalizable. So you often have to train then on the data that is your data. There's such variability between patient populations, between imaging protocols, and so on. And even go back to the science of poor cohort design and how people are actually training models. But you know, and people think to get into this field, we're going to build a model, right? Well, no. The 60% of what we're doing is the beginning part, designing the cohort, accessing the data. PACS are excellent for archiving data, not so good for getting data out for research purposes or developmental purposes and so on. And then data needs to be cleaned and standardized, normalized. So again, we've built a lot of tooling to do that, because out of necessity, I would say 60% of what we're doing is that pre-processing step. So it's not just getting access to the data, it's understanding that data cohort, understanding how data was acquired, the differences in them, a little bit different than a lab value, for example. How was that data processed, and what do you need to do to normalize the data, fill in sparse data, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot to it that happens before you go ahead and build the model. And I think that's something that people need to understand. Balance of the data set. We're seeing publications where there's really an imbalance in the data set, and right away you say, that algorithm isn't going to generalize. So a lot of things to think about in terms of the data democratization. I think it will happen, and I think it will move the field forward more quickly if we have access to more heterogeneous data and lots of data. But right now, there is the HIPAA piece, and there are organizations who feel they are the stewards of the data and need to understand and do that in a respectful way.
So Sandy, we work at the same organization. Our organization likes to make sure that we don't mess too much with our EHR. But yet we want to do amazing things. They ask us to do amazing things. How do we live in that duplicity?
Yeah, so, well, I do think it's a world where, like, I really believe in the notion of MVPs and in building software that you want to build minimum viable products. But when you look at it at the clinical level, it can actually be it can actually be easier to implement larger clinical process change where you're building new infrastructure that links to the old infrastructure but actually instantiates a new process where you have control but you're not messing so much with the existing infrastructure, with the existing processes that are underway. And I think that this relates to, if we look at the problem that we're discussing. So on the one hand, we want to implement and improve new clinical processes. On the other hand, and we want to enable AI to do that. On the other hand, we've got massive challenges with data. The data is not clean enough, aggregated enough, available enough for us to apply it to build the machine learning models to implement the change that we want to see. So one way to approach that is to say, okay, if we start with the clinical process, the new clinical process that we want to create, oftentimes it is possible to use algorithmic approaches that are not machine learning based, but nonetheless integrate with the care delivery process. And if you do that, if you put an algorithm into the care delivery process, it requires you to build the infrastructure to feed that algorithm with data that you are confident enough in to support that decision. So that forces you to develop a clean data stream so that actually operating this system over time, this clinical process over time, generates the kind of clean data that you need in order to follow up and ultimately evolve that simpler algorithm with a machine learning based one. And I think that there's another element here that relates to data democratization that's really important. Because if you're standing up support for a new process that it's algorithmically based, and therefore the IT component of that process is a significant component, and you open that infrastructure, if you open source that infrastructure or otherwise make that infrastructure widely available so that others can implement it on top of the kinds of open platforms that we've been talking about, then what you've got is you've got a piece of infrastructure implementing a clinical process in multiple places that is cleaning data consistently. And that opens up the possibility for institutions like ours to share data with one another and further expand the amount of data that models can be trained upon.
So that sounds pretty amazing. However, as that goes to thousands of hospitals, some of which may not have robust IT systems, and I'm not asking this to you, I'm asking this to the group because this was a question that evolved, was how does just a regular CIO at a community hospital prepare for this? Are they going to wait for the vendors to do it for them? How much do they dabble? How do they understand what's coming down the line? How do they know how to ask vendors the right questions? And this is to everybody, so please, from the vendor side, help us.
I think you should expect it from your vendor. I think that machine learning is becoming, as Jensen mentioned yesterday and others have talked about, the new way of writing code. It's part of computer science. Being able to include machine learning in your workflow is part of what you should be expecting from the systems that you're implementing, be them EHRs, be them ERP systems, whatnot. Which I think then gets to a question that I don't think we're quite talking about yet, which is how do you administer these once they're live? Right. How does an organization build out the structures in the same way that database administrators manage SQL databases, but probably aren't writing the code behind them? The same role needs to evolve within healthcare organizations as machine learning algorithms are deployed, populations change, types of care change, those sorts of things, and they get the care and feeding they need to continue to be viable. And I think that's the next kind of innovation space here from a deployment perspective.
I see this also in terms of modularity. As I'm listening here, I feel like we're creating sort of an ecosystem that supports AI. We talked about last mile in the first part. We're also talking about the first mile, right? The data supply and then the consumption of the answer. So there's kind of this whole framework says, I have to trigger something, I have to send data, my algorithm, here's the container where my AI is running, and it is consuming this and it is producing that. But that's a pretty containerizable thing. And then over on the other side, okay, if I get an answer, I will use it in the following way in my Epic front end and so on. So potentially, if we can continue to modularize that and think about that conceptually, then what goes on with the AI piece can not only be dropped into anybody's system, but potentially some of the learnings can be shared from one place to another. One of the, a sideline that I do, I work a lot on informatics and health IT in developing countries with OpenMRS. And there you find that they're starting to take some of these algorithms and be able to use them in their own much more simple databases and such, because that piece can be containerized to say, I'll take data, I'll give you answers, here's what you should do. So there's potential for reusing if we can put it in that kind of a framework.
So now let's say we're starting to create additional data, is what it sounds like. We're creating different layers, metadata, features, et cetera, that we can act upon. We've talked about how to make those things actionable and optimized for the user. What happens to that data? Do we throw it out? Do we version it? What happens if the algorithm gets better, but the data that was there was what made us have the action, and now we run the algorithm again and we find new answers? So I think, Seth, it's maybe back to your point of, I think things were easy when the data got made and it never changed, but now we're talking about something a little different. How do we live in that new world?
Well, I think that there's kind of multiple roles that need to come together to solve that problem. One, from a computer science and development perspective, you start designing systems with this need to continually improve and leverage that metadata and that kind of exhaust, if you will, from the system to be able to factor back in and improve the user experience. This is particularly true in the space of what I referred to earlier as relevance, where, as users are working in the system and you want to provide stronger context and better understanding of kind of what data to surface to them, you need to understand how they're continuing to use the system, how their changes in practice are changing, and it creates that continuous learning cycle. At the same time, as a healthcare organization is bringing on new clinics that might be capturing a lab value differently, but using the same machine learning algorithm, that needs to be identified. And somebody needs to either identify that a different one needs to be deployed and used in that context, or maybe the clinical workflow or the way that data is being captured upstream needs to change. So it really, I think, needs to be addressed both from a development perspective and from an IT operationalization perspective to kind of fully cover it.
Hey, Keith, you and I talked about this. It's interesting to hear the conversation because we are lucky enough that in the speech business, we've been collecting and improving for 20 years. I mean, right. So we sometimes we were joking earlier, like Nuance didn't used to call itself an AI company, even though that's kind of what we did. So I think a couple things are going to happen. One is, as Seth mentioned, all the successful software companies going forward are going to be AI based by definition, because they're not going to be able to compete from a performance point of view going forward. So I think what used to be a very specialized skill on these, just like sort of agile development took over the software world, this is really agile development because it's all data driven on a continuous learning loop. So there are going to be a lot more people that have to learn, this skill. I think back to your question about on the provider side, I agree with Seth. I think for the average hospital or practice, this is going to be a question of how do they purchase, how do they evaluate, and then how do they monitor, not development. Then you're going to have a set of people like you guys and the larger academics or immersive, they basically have always had internal IT shops of scale that are going to try to build their own stuff, and you guys are going to be in a different bucket. But again, what's interesting that we're seeing, and I know Epic is seeing this too, is every provider is struggling on the economics of the overall organization. So everyone is looking to how to monetize their clinical expertise, right? This is innovation shops are exploding, venture funds are exploding. How do I monetize my data without blowing through my responsibility to pay? This is happening everywhere. So, you're seeing new companies emerge. You've seen this on the clinical trial where they're aggregating de-identified data and people are jumping in the consortium to then monetize out to pharma and stuff. So you're just seeing an explosion of new business models around this. And you have a lot of these community hospitals who want to participate in this without actually worrying about building their own algorithm. So I think you're going to see a bifurcation or multiple stratification of the universe on the provider side as to which bucket they fall into, from ones that are, we're going to spin off a company because we've built these really cool algorithms to solve this clinical problem, all the way to the other extreme, which is, I'm just trying to survive. What do I do, like, to get through the day type of thing, right? It's going to be all over the map.
I think there's a whole spectrum, everything from folks who are innovating around the new technologies, and this is, we've seen as any new technology has come into healthcare or really any business, where you've got the innovators who are willing to make changes, and then those folks who really just want to adopt the technology at a certain point, and then the wonderful promise of being able to put some of these resources, if we can shrink wrap them into underserved areas, would be really amazing. But I think another thing that we're speaking to also is education. So the education and training really has to develop so that our clinicians understand enough to be able to critically evaluate these tools that are being shown to them and how to use them and really what they mean. And I think that's a discussion that's ongoing right now in education, and what do we do with clinicians and trainees and so forth going forward, as well as people who are already out into the practice.
Yeah, if I could comment on, so Keith, underlying part of your question, I heard sort of, what do we do to protect against patient risk that evolves from data drift, from model, bias, from, the risk of algorithms being put out but not appropriately versioned. And I think in a 2019 world, I do think that the hazard analysis processes that we have are sufficient to deal with the complexity that we're currently dealing with in the core clinical environment. But I do think that moving forward, I think these things are going to become much larger challenges. And I think that part of this involves establishing brand new communication channels. I totally agree with everything that Jonathan said about compartmentalization, but that can't distract from we need to make sure that the people who generate the data, and I think literally like the technicians on the equipment, everyone involved in the machine learning algorithm, people have to know how this data is being applied so that, and how that is changing over time so that they can highlight, situations where we're applying it to a different population than the data was actually generated on, or so that they can highlight this machine is working differently, and and that may have an effect. And I think that's a very difficult thing for organizations to put in place. But it does relate also to this question of, in terms of the community hospitals, I think that these technologies are going to be very disruptive to healthcare. And the question for all hospitals, ours, community hospitals, is going to be what things of what we've traditionally done, what do we continue to do, and what do we consume as services from others? And then how do we make sure when we're consuming services from others, we have these communication channels, technical and human, in place so that we make sure that those links remain safe?
On this topic of education, I think we'd be remiss to not mention patients as well. Their role in understanding the impact of artificial intelligence, both when they're in the clinic or when they are using a device that's probably capturing their steps and pulling in their health record, and they're sharing it between potentially applications, and they're trying to understand the complexities of what that might mean to the different organizations and companies getting access to the data. I think there's further education there that needs to happen as well, certainly.
Yeah. And I want to take that in one additional direction, which is, I mean, I'm not worried so much about changing data or changing algorithms. I don't even know if I'm supposed to eat eggs this week or not. But I do worry about disparities. I do worry about who we're doing these testing on. What is the patient demographic basis for our search? Am I testing the benefits of the Apple Watch? Well, that makes me have a subset of people that can afford an Apple Watch, right? So, and it goes beyond that. So even as Kathy talked about educating and getting this out to more people, I think we have to keep that in mind in some present and pressing way, that we can't just be doing algorithms for the people that are most amenable to it.
Okay, so since you touched on patients, let's be a little more disruptive and kind of thought experiment here to say, maybe a hospital is not the final mile. Maybe that's a little centered on people that spend a lot of time in hospitals. Maybe the final mile is to a patient's home. So recently, an algorithm came out that's able to read chest x-rays to some moderate degree, not bad. And it uses something called TensorFlow.js, where the inference model can run in the browser cache, it can run on your phone. So now, and it's just evolved in the last few months, I can now take a camera, aim it at a chest x-ray, shoot a picture, and I get back whether there's pneumothorax, consolidation, cardiomegaly, mass, nodes. It wasn't FDA approved. It says not for clinical use. That's going to happen again and again and again. Is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? If it's a bad thing, do we stop it? Do we just make it better? How do we make it better? And so, and this isn't, I think imaging always happens first because it's so much like consumer space, but this is going to happen again and again and again. Do we help to have that happen? Do we live with getting disrupted? How do we deal with all that? And then I want to talk to, as you think about that, I shared this kind of code of ethics, if you will, or code of conduct that was released by the New Work Summit a few months ago. Folks came together in different disciplines and said, how do we deal with AI? What are the new challenges that we have with AI? And I just use this thought experiment as an example of that. But if you could just opine on that, and we'll maybe go down the list on some of these things that they talked about that generically you have to think about when you're producing AI and you're putting it out in the wild. Any thoughts initially about what's happening?
My first thought is that it really comes back to workflow, which is an odd thing to bring up. But I think what you're describing is the patient becoming more and more an active part of their care team. And as they become part of the care team, the care plan around that situation needs to evolve to accommodate the patient being actively part of it, bringing data into it from IoT devices in their house, and the various levels of interaction that then need to be facilitated. It might be just a text reminder on their phone. It might be a telehealth encounter that they initiate as a result of that. And I think it's how do we continue to evolve the way that care is provided, wherever that space might be that the data is being captured, if it's in the home or in tertiary care. So I think that bigger picture needs to be looked at.
I mean, I remember, pre-easy access internet days where patients would come in and not have a clue about any diseases.
Right.
And then there was a transition to where they knew more maybe than the physician they were seeing. And there was a little while where that was really uncomfortable, and now we kind of lived through that and got to the other side of it. Is this the same thing that's going to happen again, but with intelligence that's available to them? Well,
it's a little bit of both. I mean, I think it is very important to include patients as core users of this. And we've kind of haven't done a good job of this over the past 20 years since we've said that patients should be at the center of everything. We believe that, but we don't act on it as easily as we could. But I think what patients have, if they don't have medical training, they have interest, they have time, and they have focus. And so, what we talked about at the very beginning, if there was an app which turned red when my diabetes was going haywire, or when my X-ray has come back and said, gee, your doctor really ought to know about this. Whatever it may be, if I have something which says, you should let somebody know about this, maybe that's the right tack. Maybe we said a long time ago that decision support is not intended to be an esteemed expert. It's intended to be a really conscientious medical student who knows when to tug on your coat. So maybe that's the idea. If we can have some way to say, you should be aware of something that's important, and then have them become the facilitator, the field general that says, I better see somebody about this. That may be a very important boon to health.
Yeah. I have I'll probably get shot for this, but first of all, I think I need more little acronyms after my name, Keith. I don't have to answer this question, but you have to show me how to get those. I'm going to say something a little, my own view right now is, even though I live in healthcare, I don't think the quality of the healthcare is that good, honestly. It's not that individuals are that doing, but we've all had experiences of the docs don't have enough time. What the average clinical evidence, takes 17 years or whatever the number is to get into clinical practice. You go to 3 docs, you get 3 different answers. So this may be, again, a little bit of heresy, but I don't think that, with all due respect, I don't think the bar is that high in some ways. And I know this is, and also the FDA, I mean, really? They're like the ultimate arbiter of what's good, FAA too, seriously? Right, so in one way, I'm a little scared of those inventions, but I think it's also inevitable that the tech is gonna push, and I actually think the competition is good. I don't know, I have no idea how it's gonna play out, but I think, for example, if I had something that could do a quick scan and give me a quick read, that's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, people look up, the number one source for health information is Google. There's stuff all over that's good, that's bad, who knows, right? So, in that example, versus waiting 2 weeks to get I don't know if it's really a bad thing. I mean, and we've seen enough proof already coming out that with the algorithms coming out, that the rate at which they're coming, which they're quote unquote as good, is mind-blowing. Right, so as more data gets out there, the stuff's going to get better and better. So I think having a little competition from disruptive ways to actually get better care, just as a patient, I think actually is a good thing. I'm not saying they're not going to be scoundrels out there, like the pharmacy guys who jack the price up and do bad things. I'm sure there will be, but we all know what the problem is. We spend twice as much as everybody else. Our health outcomes are terrible. We're going to run out of money. We have to do something different. Right, so I'm not saying AI is going to solve everything, but I think a little disruption is actually not a bad thing, and we're going to have to, manage through this thing, and that doesn't even deal with the underserved areas where they don't even have any access. So it's probably 100 times better than what they have today. So I'm kind of excited about what that could do, knowing that there are probably going to be some bad apples along the way.
Well, I know we were involved with decision support for medical imaging for years at the American College of Radiology, and the World Health Organization asked us to put together a symposium for ministries of health all over the world to decide on how to deploy this and does it make a difference. And that was, way, way back about 8 years ago when you had to deploy stuff commercially through software. But now, if this is the case, tomorrow something could show up on the web and all of a sudden 200 sovereign nations, ministries of health have to figure out what to do. So I don't know if the world is really ready for this. I mean, it's going to flatten it out quite a bit, but I'm not sure if the society has thought through how to transform healthcare like you're describing, Pete. I mean, I think it's probably a good thing, but I don't know if we're quite ready for it yet.
No, I don't think we are. I don't think we're ready at all, but I don't think it's maybe we need a little bit of a kick in the butt.
And I wonder, this goes back to this kind of list here. Are there things we need to think about to kind of regulate, at least if there's going to be looser regulations in general? Do you need to say, be very transparent about the data, disclose exactly what you're taking from people when you snap a picture or you grab their data, or what's the diversity of the data set? Or, this is so beyond the scope of how we describe things today that I just wonder are there rules of the road that are missing? Kathy?
There are. I think people need to have an understanding of what do the performance metrics mean. I think right now they may see a number and say, oh, that's great, 99%, it's a prediction. And what exactly is it predicting is very dependent on the data that was used to create that model, what the use case is, and so on. And I think there need to be some guide rails of things show up on the internet, but what is information that is coming from a reliable source that we need to understand? So if something's wrong with my car, I'm going to go to someone who understands the car and tell me what's wrong with it. So I think there need to be some guidelines and saying this is a reasonable algorithm or model, we've seen nonsensical answers from machine learning models come based on improper cohort development, improper clinical question that they're addressing, and so on. So I do think there need to be some education around that of the consumers who will be using these models and implementing them and understanding what they really mean.
So Pete, like when you talked about the 3 clinicians that you go to that give you 3 different opinions, now people could in theory go to 20 different models and get 20 different opinions or 10 different opinions. Yeah. Is it, no, and I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I think, as you say, Google people went out to healthcare locations and said, this is the one I trust, this is the one I don't trust, et cetera, and they kind of grew that. Is that same kind of trust you think going to grow with this space as well?
I do, and I'm not trivializing that.
Yeah.
That's likely to happen initially, but I think just for me, understanding the technology, I'd actually trust a model built on thousands of patient encounters across hundreds of physicians and one guy that happens to be covered by my payer that's within 10 miles of my house. That I have really no idea, other than I like the person, they seem good. Like, how do I really, like, I have no idea, right? So, yes, I think there's going to be rough spots where you have some horrendous stories happen. I'm not minimizing, but I think at the end of the day, if you really step back and say, are we really leveraging technology to make the care as best that we can really do? The answer is no. Yeah. And so I'm not, again, I'm hopeful but jaded on how we're going to get there, but I just, my feeling of how good we are today is a little different than probably the average person.
You know, so
Closing thoughts, Sandy. Wrap it up. Take it home.
So I 110% agree with everything you just said. And taking that as a given, that the model based on 1,000 people will be better than the model derived from one person. The fear that I have is you put that forward 10 years, and we're basing things on these models. And we are going to, I think that the problem of bias is going to become really, really severe, because it's not just that we need these models to be built on a diversity of people, right? We need enough representatives from every single group to make the models powerful enough. So I think that there's a tremendous risk associated with creating disparities for minority groups that are currently known to exist, and I think that there's a risk of creating entirely new minority groups that are inappropriately served. So I think that's what we have to protect against.
Well, I think we could go on for hours. So I was worried we were going to fill an hour and 15. I think we could go on for hours. So I want to thank you very much for this esteemed panel, and thank you for all your comments. Thank you.